The first time Gabriel saw an alien cry, it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He had seen suffering before, too much of it, honestly. In the back alleys of this city, pain was just another currency. But this was different. She stood beneath a rusted neon sign that flickered weakly, its dull glow casting jagged shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. She was trembling, her forearms clutching at an empty satchel as if sheer force of will could make it whole again. Her long, yellow hair clung to her damp skin, her violet complexion darkened with grief. Sira, that was her name. Telani weren't built for this kind of place. Their kind came from the lush world of Vesktar, where sky bridges wound through luminous forests and their society hummed with quiet, ordered beauty. They weren't meant for the filth of humanity's slums, for the smoke-clogged streets of a world that never slept. And yet here she was. Gabriel approached cautiously, hands in the pockets of his worn leather coat. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't exactly the rescuing type. Maybe it was something about the way she was shaking. Maybe it was the soft whimpering sound vibrating in her throat. Or maybe it was because he knew exactly what it felt like to lose something you could never get back. "You all right?" he asked. Her head snapped up. Her species had no pupils, just smooth, luminous eyes that flickered with emotion. Right now they burned with raw, desperate fear. "They took them," she rasped. Her voice was thick, strangled, the way voices got when someone had cried so hard their body started giving up. "Took what?" She clutched the satchel tighter, pressing it against her chest. "My eggs, my young. Stole." Gabriel's stomach twisted. Egg theft was common on the black market. Alien broods fetched a high price, depending on the species. Some were raised as pets, some were harvested for genetic material, others, well, the darker possibilities weren't something he wanted to dwell on. "Who took them?" His voice was flat, controlled. Her frills twitched, a sign of shame. "A human." "Of course." Gabriel exhaled through his nose, dragging a hand down his face. Humans were everywhere in the galactic underworld. They were adaptable, ruthless, and, worst of all, greedy. If there was a market for something, you could bet a human had already figured out how to exploit it. "How long ago?" he asked. "Hours," her breath hitched. I chased them, lost the trail near the market district. I tried to find someone, anyone, but no one would help me." She looked away, her hands curling into fists. "They laughed at me." Gabriel clenched his jaw. He could picture it. A lone T-Lan woman, stumbling through the streets, pleading for help in a city that had no kindness to spare. "And I thought I should have guarded them better," she whispered. "That I was a fool to carry them without protection. That if I was not strong enough to keep my own children safe, I did not deserve to have them." Her voice cracked on the last word. Gabriel cursed under his breath. This wasn't just theft. This was cruelty. And for what? Credits? Some fat, entitled bastard looking to buy a handful of stolen lives? He studied her again. Really studied her. The way she held herself. The fine jewelry woven into her braids, the silken fabric of her clothing now torn and dirty. She wasn't just anyone. "You're not from around here," he noted. Sira swallowed, her throat bobbing. "No, your nobility." A flinch, small but there. "I was." He didn't press. He could put the pieces together. A noble woman, far from home, traveling alone with her brood. She had left for a reason, one that had probably cost her everything. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, all that mattered was that someone had stolen her children. And Gabriel had a feeling he already knew where to start looking. He sighed, rolling his shoulders. "All right, here's what's going to happen." Sira blinked. "You will help me?" He smirked. "Depends. You planning to stab me after?" Her frills twitched. "Confusion, maybe." "Relax," he said, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'll help. But first I need details." She straightened, her breath still shaky but steadier than before. "I will tell you everything." "Good." He turned, motioning for her to follow. He didn't say it out loud, but he already knew one thing for certain. Somewhere in this city, some bastard had made a very, very bad mistake. The city of Vespera never truly slept. It pulsed, it flickered, it breathed. Towering skyscrapers stabbed into a sky thick with pollution, their neon billboards flashing advertisements in 100 different languages. Overhead, sleek air speeders zipped between elevated highways, their engines humming through the fog. Below, on the lower levels, where sunlight was a distant memory, life crawled. The streets slithered with movement, bodies wrapped in long coats, faces obscured by helmets, masks, or worse. The lower district, where Gabriel and Syrah now walked, was a labyrinth of decaying metal and flickering neon. The air stank of burnt wires, chemical runoff, and old rain pooling in the cracks of the pavement. Trash skittered along the streets, carried by unseen currents of artificial wind from the ventilation ducts above. Everything here was for sale. Drugs, weapons, illegal tech, and stolen lives. Gabriel moved with purpose, shoulders hunched beneath his battered coat, boots crunching against grime-slicked pavement. His hand hovered near his concealed firearm, not obvious, but not hidden either. A message. He wasn't prey. He was a predator. Behind him, Syrah walked with stiff, controlled movements, her long golden hair damp from the lingering rain, her violet skin illuminated by the neon haze. She looked out of place here, too refined, too unbroken. Even in her grief, she carried herself like someone who had never begged for anything in her life. That, Gabriel knew, would change soon enough. He led her down a narrow alley, past a row of rundown stalls where vendors hawked black market wares beneath glowing banners. Augmented limbs, memory chips, weapons stripped from corpses. One shop even displayed a collection of preserved alien organs in glass jars, their fluorescent hues pulsing faintly in the dim light. Syrah shuddered but said nothing. At the end of the alley, nestled between two abandoned storefronts, stood the Rusted Crown, a bar, a meeting ground, a cesspit of criminals, informants, and people who knew exactly how deep the darkness went. Gabriel pushed open the door. The smell hit first. Stale liquor, engine oil, sweat, and something faintly metallic. The walls were covered in peeling holoposters, their animated displays glitching in slow loops. A flickering neon sign above the bar cast everything in a sickly green hue. At the counter, Vic, a grizzled cyborg with a left eye that clicked every time he blinked, was polishing a glass that had never been clean a day in its life. Gabriel strode up, resting an elbow on the counter. "I need information." Vic didn't look up. "Do I look like an information booth?" Gabriel slid a credit chip across the counter. Now Vic looked up. His cybernetic eye whirred as it scanned Gabriel's face. "Haven't seen you in a while, Gabe. Figured you finally got smart and left this rock." "Still here," Gabriel muttered. "For now." Vic's gaze flicked past him, landing on Syrah. His expression shifted, subtle but there. Interest, curiosity, and then understanding. "Ah," he murmured. "You're asking about the eggs." Syrah inhaled sharply. She stepped forward, hands clenched at her sides. "Do you know where they are?" Vic sighed, setting down his glass. "Word is, Jarek's crew pulled something big tonight. Stole a rare brood, high-value cargo. Buyers lined up." Gabriel exhaled sharply. Jarek. A smuggler, mid-level in the criminal food chain, dangerous enough to be a problem, but not clever enough to hold onto power for long. Too stupid to be careful, too violent to underestimate. "Where?" Gabriel asked. Vic hesitated. "You sure you want to go digging into this?" Gabriel just stared. Vic sighed again. Warehouse 99, okay, dock sector. They're holding shipments till the buyer arrives. Syrah stepped forward. How long until? Could be any time, Vic interrupted. A deal like this, they'll want to offload fast. He glanced at Gabriel. You don't owe these aliens anything, you know. Gabriel didn't answer. He turned and walked out. Syrah hesitated, then followed. The warehouse district sat on the city's edge, where towering storage units loomed like metal monoliths against the night sky. The air was colder here, tinged with the scent of rust and ozone. Massive cranes stood motionless above the loading docks, their long arms reaching toward the stars. Gabriel crouched behind a cargo container, scanning the area. 6 guards, armed, but relaxed. They weren't expecting trouble. He turned to Syrah. She was breathing too fast. You've ever done this before? He murmured. She shook her head. All right, stay low, stay quiet. If things go south, you run. Her jaw tightened. I won't run. He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he nodded toward the far side of the warehouse. You want to help? Cause a distraction. Draw them toward the east side. Give me 10 seconds to get inside. She hesitated. Syrah, he said, softer this time. Can you do that? A long breath, then a slow nod. She slipped into the shadows. Gabriel counted. 1, 2, 3. A metal crate crashed to the ground. The sound rippled through the loading bay, sharp and sudden. The guards cursed, weapons raised. Gabriel didn't wait. He moved. He reached the warehouse door, fingers flying over the security panel. 3 seconds. 2. It clicked open. Inside, the air was cold. The hum of containment fields vibrated in his skull. Crates lined the walls, some stacked haphazardly, others sealed with glowing locks. He scanned the labels. Then, a temperature-controlled container, marked in an unfamiliar script. He pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in a bed of silk, were 6 speckled eggs. Gabriel exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. And a gun cocked behind his head. Well, well, a voice sneered. Didn't expect to see you here, Gabriel. Jarek. Gabriel slowly raised his hands. The cold press of the gun barrel against Gabriel's temple wasn't new. Unpleasant, sure, but familiar. He exhaled slowly, calculating his next move. Jarek's crew was reckless. That made them dangerous. A man who couldn't measure his own risks was unpredictable. If Gabriel made the wrong move, the night would end with his body sinking into one of Vespera's industrial canals. Just another lost soul in the city's underbelly. The warehouse was eerily silent. Only the soft hum of containment fields and the rhythmic flicker of overhead lights filled the space. Stacked crates cast jagged shadows across the floor, the air thick with the acrid scent of coolant, synthetic fuel, and sweat. A chuckle broke the quiet. Didn't expect to find you poking around my business, Gabe. Jarek's voice carried that smug amusement Gabriel had always found irritating. He kept his hands relaxed, tilting his head slightly. What can I say? You've got an interesting inventory. Jarek stepped closer, boots scraping against the concrete. That's so, and what exactly were you planning to do with my cargo? Gabriel didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to the crate he had just pried open. Inside, 6 pale, speckled eggs rested within a cushioned compartment, nestled under delicate layers of organic silk. Even through the faint shimmer of the containment field, he could see them pulse. Alive, stirring quietly within their shells. Not just cargo, lives. Syrah had stopped breathing. She remained in the shadows, but Gabriel could feel her presence, coiled, tense. The membranes along her jaw, normally in constant, subtle motion, had gone completely still, a sign of restrained fury. She was waiting for an opening, for a moment. for action. But Gabriel needed to keep this from turning into a disaster. For now, he forced a smirk, shifting slightly. Didn't know you were in the childcare business, Jarek. Jarek chuckled, though his eyes remained cold. You know me, always looking for new markets. Gabrielle nodded toward the crate. And what's the going rate for stolen broods these days? Jarek shrugged. Depends on the buyer. There it was. The confirmation. The eggs hadn't been sold yet. Gabriel heard Sarah inhale sharply. She'd caught it too. Jarek smirked. What's this, Gabe? Didn't take you for the sentimental type? Gabriel exhaled, carefully choosing his words. I care when people make bad deals. For the first time, Jarek hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Gabriel caught it. He pressed forward. Do you know what happens if a Talani brood perishes in human custody? He asked, his voice calm but pointed. Ever seen how their kind reacts to loss? Jarek scoffed. What? They gonna cry me to death? Gabriel's smirk didn't reach his eyes. They don't grieve, Jarek. They burn. Silence. One of the guards shifted uneasily. Another tightened his grip on his weapon. Gabriel kept his voice steady. You think this is just another black market deal? That these are just pets or some collector's prize? He shook his head. You let them die, and every Talani within 100 light-years will come for you. And they don't negotiate. Jarek's jaw tensed. Gabriel saw it, the first crack in his confidence. And so did Syrah. She moved. Fast. One moment she was a shadow, then a blur of motion. Her strike was precise. The nearest guard gasped, stumbling as his weapon slipped from his grasp. Jarek cursed, reaching for his gun. Gabriel reacted instantly. He twisted, wrenching the barrel aside as the shot fired. A searing bolt slicing past his ear, leaving a blackened scorch mark on the warehouse wall. In one swift motion, he wrenched the gun free, reversed his grip, and slammed the butt of it against Jarek's temple. Jarek staggered back, muttering curses under his breath. Another guard lunged, a blade flashing under the dim lights. Gabriel pivoted, catching the attacker's wrist and twisting sharply. With a quick strike, he sent the man sprawling to the floor. A third guard scrambled for his comm device. Something whistled through the air. The man flinched, jerking back as the device tumbled from his hand. Gabriel turned sharply to Syrah. That wasn't exactly quiet. She bared her teeth. He's still breathing. Jarek groaned, wiping the blood from his temple. His fury burned brighter than the pain. You just made a big mistake, he hissed. Gabriel leveled the stolen gun at him. Wouldn't be my first. For a long moment, nothing moved. Only the soft hum of containment fields filled the space. Yeah? Jarek laughed. Low at first, then deeper, mocking. You idiot, he muttered. You really don't get it, do you? Gabriel frowned. They're already here, Jarek said, smirking despite the blood trailing down his face. The real buyers. Syrah inhaled sharply. Gabriel barely had time to register the shift before the warehouse exploded with light. Blinding, harsh. Then came the sound. A low vibration, deep and resonant, thrumming through the walls. A frequency just beyond human hearing, heavy enough to make Gabriel's bones hum. Shadows moved beyond the glare. Tall, silent, armed. Not human. Gabriel's grip on the gun tightened. These weren't reinforcements. Not allies. Syrah's breath hitched. He didn't take his eyes off the figures approaching. Well, he muttered. Guess we're not done yet. The warehouse trembled under the weight of something unseen. The air itself seemed to contract, thick with static, vibrating with an unnatural hum that settled deep in Gabriel's bones. He adjusted his grip on the stolen gun, forcing himself to stay steady despite the blinding floodlights cutting through the dust-filled air. Beyond the light, figures moved, tall, deliberate, wrong. Not human, not friendly. Gabriel had tangled with a lot of dangerous people in his time, but these? Vorloon. He had only ever heard of them in hushed conversations, their name whispered like a warning. Enforcers, intermediaries, power brokers of the kind who never had to raise their voices or their weapons, because when they spoke, people obeyed. And now they were here for the eggs. Jarek, still kneeling on the floor, grinned despite the blood smeared across his jaw. "Told you, Gabe, this ain't your fight." Gabriel ignored him. His focus was on Sirach. She hadn't moved. She stood rigid beside the overturned crates, her golden hair catching the light in sharp streaks. Her frills, normally fluid with every shift of emotion, had gone utterly still. Not fear. Something else. Recognition. Gabriel's pulse ticked faster. "You know them?" Sarah's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands clenched at her sides. Before she could speak, the Vorloon leader stepped forward. Gabriel tensed. It was taller than the others, its dark exoskeletal form reflecting the flickering warehouse lights in a way that made it hard to tell where the shadows ended and its body began. It carried no visible weapon. It didn't need one. When it spoke, the words didn't come from its mouth. They slid into Gabriel's mind, uninvited, pressing against his thoughts with a force that wasn't sound but something deeper. "These belong to us." A statement, not a threat. A certainty. Gabriel set his jaw. "That's funny. You don't look like the mothering type." The Vorlon turned its eyeless face toward him, considering. Its presence was unbearable, like standing too close to a storm before it broke. Sira finally spoke, her voice raw. "You cannot have them." The Vorlon tilted its head at her, as if mildly intrigued. Then it took another step forward. Gabriel lifted the gun higher. It stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the Vorlon leader spoke again, and this time the words carried weight. "This is not your concern, exile." Gabriel flicked a glance at Sirah. She flinched at the word, her frills twitching with something sharp. Pain or fury, or both. "Exile." The word hung between them like a blade. Sirah wasn't just running from something, she had been cast out. Gabriel exhaled slowly. The pieces were falling into place, but none of them made sense yet. Jarek chuckled, wiping blood from his chin. "See, this ain't just some back alley deal gone wrong. You're standing in the middle of something bigger than you, Gabe." Gabriel ignored him, keeping his eyes locked on the Vorlon leader. He needed to keep this from turning into a firefight. "You seem like reasonable people," he said lightly. "Why don't we talk?" The Vorlon leader didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stood there, a figure carved from something ancient and unyielding. "There is nothing to discuss. The eggs are ours." Gabriel kept his expression neutral. "You got a receipt?" Silence. Then, the Vorloon laughed. Not out loud, not in any way that could be heard. It bloomed inside Gabriel's skull, an echoing alien amusement that wasn't sound but something deeper, something intrusive. His stomach twisted at the sensation, his grip tightening on the gun as he shoved the feeling out of his mind. The Vorloon leader regarded him for another moment. Then the laughter vanished, replaced by cold finality. "You will not leave with them." Gabriel didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said, and pulled the trigger. The shot roared through the warehouse, the muzzle flash cutting through the dim haze. And the Vorloon was already gone. Not moved, not dodged, just not there. Gabriel barely had time to process before a shockwave slammed into him, an invisible force sending him flying backward. He crashed into a metal crate, pain ricocheting through his ribs. The entire warehouse shuddered. Overhead lights flickered wildly. their circuits shorting under some unseen pressure. Cyril was already moving. She drove forward like a blade, closing the distance between herself and the Vorlon in a blink. Her knife caught the leader's shoulder. Black fluid sprayed across the concrete. But the creature didn't falter, didn't flinch. It simply raised one hand. Gabriel saw the air around Syrah bend, twist. And then she was lifted, feet kicking against nothing. She choked, her body struggling against an unseen grip. Her knife clattered to the floor. Gabriel didn't think. He grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage and threw it with everything he had. It struck the Vorlon's side, embedding deep. The creature shuddered. Its grip on Syrah faltered. She hit the ground hard, coughing. The Vorlon staggered back, its body flickering, not in pain, but in something else. Uncertainty. Gabriel pushed himself upright, aiming the gun again, ready to fire. But then the Vorlon vanished. Not retreated, not fled. Just gone. The others followed. And just like that, they were alone. The warehouse groaned under its own weight, beams snapping as flames licked hungrily at the edges of the wreckage. Smoke curled through the air, choking the remaining light. Gabriel exhaled sharply, pressing a hand against his ribs. Well, that was terrible. Syrah didn't answer. She was already on her knees, cradling the crate in her arms. Her hands trembled as she pressed her palm against the eggs, as if she needed to feel their warmth to believe they were still there. Gabriel watched her in silence. There was something raw in the way she held them, a kind of desperate reverence he hadn't expected. He had seen people fight for money, for survival, for revenge. But this was something else, something deeper. He sighed, rolling his shoulders, ignoring the sharp pain the movement sent through him. We need to go before someone decides to check on all this noise. Syrah finally looked at him. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, unshaken. Wherever you go, she said, I will follow. Gabriel blinked. Of all the things she could have said, he hadn't expected that. A response rose to his lips, something sarcastic, something deflective, but he caught himself before he said it. Instead, he just nodded. All right, he muttered, let's get out of here. And together they disappeared into the night. The night swallowed them whole as they fled the burning wreckage of the warehouse. Gabriel's pulse still pounded in his ears, each step sending a sharp reminder through his bruised ribs. Vespera's underbelly stretched ahead, an endless maze of flickering neon, narrow alleys, and shadows that moved when you weren't looking. Behind him, Syrah kept pace, her arms wrapped protectively around the crate of eggs. Her breathing was steady, but her grip? Too tight, as if she feared they would vanish the second she let go. Gabriel didn't blame her. They had barely made it out alive, and the Vorlon... They had just disappeared. That was the part that unsettled him the most. No corpses, no wreckage left behind. Just the heavy certainty that the fight wasn't over. They needed to disappear too, fast. Gabriel turned down a side street, leading them into a quieter district where the glow of the city dimmed and the air smelled less like burnt circuitry and more like rain. A safe house wasn't far, one of the many forgotten places he had stashed away for emergencies. Tonight definitely counted. The safe house. The door hissed open, revealing a small, cluttered room lit only by the dying blue glow of a wall panel. The air was stale, thick with dust and old machinery. Gabriel gestured inside. It's not the royal suite, but it's safe. Syrah stepped past him, scanning the space with calculating eyes. Her posture had shifted, not quite relaxed, but not as tightly wound as before. She set the crate down on a table, pressing a palm against the top. Gabriel closed the door behind them, engaging the manual lock. No fancy tech, just bolts and reinforced steel. He had learned a long time ago that the best security was the kind that couldn't be hacked remotely. He turned back just in time to see Syrah lower her forehead against the crate's surface. The tension in her shoulders melted. A whisper of relief. A moment where she let herself believe they were truly safe. Gabriel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. So? What the hell just happened back there? She didn't lift her head. You already know. Yeah, I know we just pissed off some serious players. He folded his arms. What I don't know is why they called you Exile. That got a reaction. Sarah's fingers curled against the crate. Seconds stretched between them, silent and heavy. Then she straightened, tilting her chin slightly. Plani law is absolute. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. You saying you broke it? I left. The way she said it, flat and certain, told him it wasn't that simple. They don't like when people leave? Sarah shook her head. They do not like when people abandon their duties. Gabrielle leaned against the table, watching her carefully. And your duty was? Her jaw tightened. It was the first time she had looked truly uncomfortable since he met her. Then, something clicked. Gabriel's gaze flickered to the eggs, then back to her. Nobility. Duty. You were supposed to be raising them in the palace, weren't you? He guessed. Sarah didn't answer. Which was an answer. Gabriel let out a slow whistle. That's why? They're worth so much. The eggs weren't just valuable, they were important. Sarah looked at him then, her expression unreadable. Talani young do not belong to a single parent, she said. They are raised by the ruling caste. Their training, their futures, are decided before they hatch. Gabrielle frowned. And you didn't want that? No. She turned back to the crate, running a hand over the smooth surface. I wanted them to have a choice. It made sense now, why she had been alone, why no one had helped her when the eggs were stolen. She wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a fugitive. Gabriel scrubbed a hand down his face. You realize they're going to keep coming, right? Sarah nodded. I know. He sighed. And I assume your plan was just hope they wouldn't find you? She glanced at him. No. My plan was to make it far enough that when they did, I was willing to fight for them. Gabriel tilted his head. That plan got me shot at. She didn't blink. Yet you stayed. He didn't have an immediate response to that. Instead, he sat on the edge of the table, staring at the crate. So what now? You just going to keep running forever? Sarah hesitated. Something passed over her expression. Uncertainty. Gabriel wasn't sure why, but the sight of it unsettled him. She had been so sure of herself before, so unwavering. Then, softly, she said, No. I have already run too far. The words carried more weight than he expected. Gabriel rubbed the back of his neck. He had been in this situation before. Not the alien eggs and telepathic enforcers part, but the part where someone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. He had been there. And he knew the look of someone realizing it too late. Sarah turned to him fully now, watching him in a way that made him feel like he was being measured. You saved them, she said, when you could have walked away. Gabriel shrugged. Wasn't exactly an option at that point. It was. She stepped closer. But you didn't take it. Gabriel wasn't sure what to say to that. He had plenty of things he could say. He could play it off, make some sarcastic comment, pretend like it hadn't been a choice at all. But she would see through it. So instead, he sighed and rubbed at his temple. Yeah, well, guess I make bad decisions. Sarah studied him a moment longer, then reached out, hesitant, careful, and placed a hand against his forearm. Gabriel tensed. Her touch was warm. Softer than he expected. I am in your debt, Gabriel, she said. You have given me back something I never thought I would hold again. He swallowed. I wouldn't say that too loudly. I don't do well with people owing me things. Sarah's frills twitched, a movement he was starting to recognize as amusement. Then I will not say it. She stepped back. But I will still repay it. Gabriel shook his head. You're stubborn, you know that? I do. She turned back to the crate, running her hands over it again. A mother's touch. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair, already regretting his next words. You're going to need a better plan than fight every bounty hunter and crime lord who comes after you. Sierra arched an eyebrow. You have a better one? Gabriel sighed. He really should have walked away. Instead, he muttered, Yeah, I might. Sarah smiled. Then I will follow. He cursed under his breath. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? The hatchlings had barely taken their first breaths before the city came for them. Gabriel had felt it coming, a weight pressing on the edges of his instincts, a storm waiting to break. He had spent enough years on the fringes of law and survival to know when a fight wasn't over. And this one? It was just beginning. The hatchlings had hatched under Surah's watchful gaze, their tiny limbs stretching, their frills flickering as they chirped and tumbled over one another. The smallest had settled onto Gabriel's shoulder, curling into the fabric of his coat as if it had always belonged there. Sirah's expression had been unreadable, something between awe and quiet terror. "They are safe," she had whispered. Gabriel had almost let himself believe it. Then the lights had flickered. Not the usual power fluctuations of Vespera's failing infrastructure, no. This was something else. Something deliberate. Sirah tensed. Gabriel felt the hair on his arms rise. He turned toward the door of the safe house just as the air grew heavy. And then, a voice. "You cannot keep what is not yours." The Vorlun had found them. The walls seemed to tremble, shadows stretching unnaturally. The hatchlings chirped in distress, sensing the shift in the air. Surah rose to her feet instantly, her body a shield between them and the unseen threat. Gabriel already had his gun drawn. A tear in the space before them widened, like reality itself was being pulled apart. Then the Vorlun stepped through. Not one, six, and at the center, the leader from the warehouse. Gabriel's grip tightened on his gun. Last time, they had vanished when wounded, but this time, they weren't leaving without blood. Sirah let out a sharp breath, lowering into a fighting stance. "You have no claim here." The Vorland leader tilted its head, voice pushing into their minds. "We have every claim." Gabriel took a slow step forward, keeping his gun leveled. "You lost your chance when you ran from the last fight." The leader didn't react. The Vorlan didn't have expressions, not in a way that humans understood. But something in the air thickened. Hostility, expectation, a waiting predator. "We do not flee," the leader said. "We observe. We adapt." Gabriel narrowed his eyes. "Yeah? Then observe this." He fired. The shot cracked through the room, hitting the Vorlun dead center. The impact sent a pulse of dark energy rippling across its exoskeleton, but it didn't fall. Didn't even flinch. Instead, it raised a hand and the bullet disintegrated into dust. Gabriel's stomach twisted. That was new. The Vorlun leader took a step forward. The entire room seemed to warp with its presence. Sirah lunged. Her knife sliced through the air faster than thought, but before it could strike, the Vorlun leader simply reached out and caught her wrist. And then she collapsed. Not from injury, not from pain, from something else. Gabriel barely had time to process it before his own body locked up. He tried to move, but his muscles refused. A force pressed down on them both, something cold and vast, like a hand closing around their very existence. The Vorlan leader's voice echoed in his mind. "You do not understand what you protect." Gabriel gritted his teeth. Then maybe explain it instead of just being creepy about it. The Vorloon leader remained still. Then, to Gabriel's shock, it released them. Sarah gasped, stumbling back. Gabriel caught himself before he fell, breathing heavily. Whatever they had done, it wasn't meant to kill. It was a warning. The Vorloon's eyeless face turned toward the crate, where the hatchlings huddled together. "They are not yours to raise," the leader said. Sira's frills flared. "They are mine to protect." The Vorloon leader tilted its head again, as if considering. Gabriel watched, instinct screaming. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was something older. Older than human laws. Older than anything he had been prepared for. Then the leader stepped back. The air lightened, the weight pressing on their bones lifted. Gabriel frowned. Wait, that's it? The Vorloon leader's presence pressed against his mind one final time. "We will not intervene, but we will be watching." And then they were gone. The space where they had stood sealed itself as if they had never been there at all. Gabriel let out a slow, unsteady breath. What the hell just happened? Syrah exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. Her frills fluttered in a way that told him she didn't fully understand either. Then she looked at the hatchlings, still curled together in the crate. Gabriel followed her gaze. "They let us go," she said, "because they believe we will fail." Gabriel frowned. "Fail at what?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Raising them." The realization hit like a punch to the ribs. This hadn't been about stealing the eggs. The Vorloon hadn't wanted them destroyed. They had wanted them controlled, shaped into something else. Gabriel clenched his jaw. "Well, screw that." Syrah looked at him, something softening in her eyes. "You mean to stay?" she said. It wasn't a question. Gabriel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess I do." She stepped closer, standing beside him. He could feel the warmth of her presence, the quiet strength in the way she held herself. "Then we will raise them," she said, "together." Gabriel glanced at her, then at the hatchling still clinging to his coat. It chirped at him, trusting. He sighed. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm a dad now." Syrah's laughter was quiet but real. Gabriel shook his head, stepping forward, standing over the crate. He reached down, resting a hand against the surface. The hatchlings chirped in response, pressing close to his touch. A family. Not by blood, not by tradition, but by choice. And that was something no one, not the Varla, not the Talani, not the entire damn galaxy, could take from them. Wherever they went next, they would go as one. And for the first time in a long time, Gabriel wasn't running. He was building something worth staying for. The hatchlings were growing. Days blurred into weeks, and with each passing cycle, the 6 tiny creatures became stronger, bolder. Their frills, once soft and fragile, flared with color as they chirped at one another, testing their voices. Their limbs, once awkward and weak, now carried them across the safe house with surprising speed. Gabriel learned quickly that they were curious little things. They climbed onto anything, chewed through anything, and made noise at all hours of the night. The smallest, one who had chosen him, was the worst offender, constantly tangling itself in his coat, nipping at his fingers when he tried to sleep. Seer had called them fast learners. Gabriel called them menaces. But he never told them to stop. Gabriel sat at the edge of the safe house, watching Vespera's skyline flicker in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't planning an escape, wasn't thinking about his next job, next city, next fight. And that was new. Syrah sat beside him, silent for a moment. Then she spoke. "They should not have survived," she admitted. Gabriel turned to her. "You mean the eggs?" She nodded, exhaling. "By all accounts, they should have been lost. The Vorlon should have taken them. My people should have found me first. You should have walked away. Gabriel smirked. Guess I make bad decisions. She tilted her head, watching him. Is that what you think? Gabriel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I don't know what I think. He glanced back at the safe house, where the hatchlings had curled together in a tangled pile of limbs and tails. But I know this feels different. Sira studied him. Different how? Gabriel hesitated. He wasn't good at this, talking about things that mattered, but Sira wasn't asking out of curiosity. She needed to hear it. He sighed. I've spent my whole life moving, never staying anywhere too long, never giving a damn about anyone but myself. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, then gestured toward the hatchlings. And now I've got 6 of them crawling all over me. I don't even know how it happened. Sira's frills twitched. They chose you. Yeah, well, didn't give me much of a choice, did they? No, she said softly. But you gave them one. Gabriel frowned. She turned to him fully, golden hair catching the light. You could have let them be taken. You could have walked away, but you didn't. Her voice was steady, certain. You chose to fight for them. Gabriel exhaled, shaking his head. I didn't sign up for this, you know. Sira's lips quirked slightly. Neither did I. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the city low and constant in the background. Then Sira spoke again. What happens now? Gabriel considered that. You tell me. Sira blinked, tilting her head. You would leave the choice to me? He shrugged. They're your kids. She smiled slightly, glancing at the hatchlings. They are ours. Gabriel stilled. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. Soft, absolute, like a truth she had already accepted. He cleared his throat, shifting. All right then, what do you think? Sira looked back toward the city. We cannot keep running. Gabriel nodded, agreed. She exhaled, fingers brushing against her arm in thought. The Vorlons said they would watch. Gabriel flexed his jaw. Yeah, I don't like that part. Nor do I, but they let us go. For now. Sira considered that, then looked back at him. Then we must ensure they never see us as a threat. Gabriel snorted. We're raising 6 little troublemakers. That ship's already sailed. Sira huffed a quiet laugh. Then we must be ready. Gabriel leaned back against the wall, looking at her. You planning to build a fortress or something? No, she said simply. A home. Gabriel blinked. He hadn't thought about it like that. He had never had a home. Not really. Not until now. The hatchlings chirped and tumbled over one another as the first light of morning bled into the sky. Gabriel stood at the doorway, watching them. The smallest curled around his boot, blinking up at him expectantly. He sighed, crouching down. You're not gonna leave me alone, are you? It chirped. He ran a hand over its frills, shaking his head. Yeah, I figured. Sira appeared beside him, watching with a quiet smile. It is bonded to you. Gabriel glanced at her. Yeah? And what about you? She held his gaze for a moment, then she stepped forward, pressing her palm gently against his chest, a gesture of trust, of something unspoken. Breed joint. I have already chosen, she murmured. Gabriel swallowed. His heart beat harder than he wanted to admit. He covered her hand with his own, holding it there. All right, he said softly. Let's build something real. Sira smiled. Behind them the hatchlings chirped. And for the first time Gabriel wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking forward.